Okay, I guess since we have a critical mass here, I'll just start. So hi, welcome everyone to AAU's first inaugural community talk series. Um, my name is Grace Fan, and I'm AAU's Youth Programs Coordinator. And we're really excited to kick off this event series. We plan to have this be kind of a regular space where we invite folks from the AAU community to talk about their history and experience with AAU and political organizing more broadly. I think just recently with the things that have been going on and the political climate, we've been feeling like there's an especially dire need for connecting across generations and also like honoring our histories. So that's kind of the intention for this talk series. And today we'll be talking with MaryYee, who was a member of Yellow Seeds and a founder of AAU. And just in terms of like housekeeping stuff, we'll be recording today's talk. So if you don't feel comfortable having your video on, feel free to turn your video off. And then another thing is that we will be having a Q&A session at the end. So if you have a question, you can either pop it in the chat or you can, during the Q&A session, raise your hand and we can like unmute you and you can ask your question. So that's that. Yeah, and so this is Mary, as you can see, she's spotlighted. And I think we were just kind of gonna do like a Q&A style, like or like a conversation style between me and Mary. And so the first question that I have is that, Mary, you're one of the people who has known AAU before it began and who has seen it through so many stages of its history. And we're hoping that you can help us learn about AAU's beginnings. So first, can you just tell us a little about who you are and your history and how you became a political activist?
Thanks, Grace. I want to thank Alex and Grace and AAU for inviting me for this talk. And I feel like now I am an elder of the Asian American movement in Philadelphia. So I want to begin talking about how I became political active actually in college and then got to Philadelphia. So my political activism actually began in 1970, which some of you will remember was the year that the secret strikes against Cambodia and Laos were basically exposed. And at that time, there was really a very, very strident and very powerful anti-war movement. And when this news came out, the nation really exploded, and especially the students who were involved in the anti-war movement. So what happened in a lot of college campuses was that we went on strike for spring semester. We might have started spring semester, with classes for, I don't know, maybe a month. But then after that, there were no more classes, at least where I was going to school. And we had teach-ins. So there was a lot of education going on, a lot of political education going on. Various people spoke from various viewpoints. I remember that for the first time, the Asian students on my campus, which was Princeton at the time, actually came together. And we came together to discuss our views about the war. And everybody, and honestly, was against the war. This included international students as well, because we recognized this was an issue of US imperialism, basically wanting to exploit the natural resources in Southeast Asia, right? Also, they're following on the steps of colonialism, on, basically following in the footsteps of the French and the British. So one of the things that we did, which was remarkable, was that we bought a full page ad in the school newspaper. And there were about 120 students that signed on to this petition against the war. So many of us didn't go to graduation. We boycotted graduation. And then that fall, I was coming to Penn to go to urban planning school. So at the time, there was actually quite an impressive network among Asian American activists across the country. So some of the classmates of mine were from California or Hawaii or New York. and people knew people who were going to come to Philadelphia or be nearby. So when I got to Philadelphia, there was already kind of a critical mass of students who were introduced to each other, you know, maybe kind of, well, virtually back then would have been, I guess, by telephone. But anyway, we started to talk about having a group that was politically active. And at that point, it was still an issue about, you know, doing activities against the war, but also trying to build the Asian American movement. So what did that mean at the time? Well, part of that was involved with anti-war movement, because the anti-war movement generated a lot of anti-Asian racism. And this was especially true against Asian women. And so that was one focus. And then in general, too, it was the issue of looking what was going on in our communities. I remember really being impressed by the African-American students at Princeton who got up in a teach-in and said, you know, we're anti-war, but we're not putting our efforts into the anti-war effort like the white people are, because our communities are suffering because of the resources that are not being devoted to our communities, but are going to the war. So that struck a chord in a lot of us who were from Chinatowns or little Tokyos. And so we said, you know, that's what we're going to do too, because we realized that our communities didn't have quality schooling, we didn't have health centers, parks, we didn't have any of that community support that we should have as a community. So when we came to Philadelphia, we met some folks from here, such as Jim Kawano, who has been active in JACL for a long time, as well as Chris Young and Madeline Young, who lived in Chinatown. Nelson Chan, whose family had a business in Chinatown. And we basically started just talking to each other. We also had some grad students from Penn that joined us, some engineering students from Penn. And so some people were interested in having more information about China. Some people were interested in the Asian American movement. Some people were interested in doing more service work. So what happened is we kind of combined all that. So I think another thing to understand at the time was that in the world at large, there were all these national liberation struggles. And, you know, the Vietnam War was also, you know, I mean, it was a real, it was a national liberation struggle on the part of the Vietnamese and Cambodians and Lao people. And also, you know, there were a lot of national liberation struggles in Africa, Angola, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, you know, Kenya. And so we really identified with those in terms of being part of the anti-imperialist struggle, anti-colonialist struggle. So because China was also very supportive of these national liberation struggles, and because those of us who were Chinese in America had felt, you know, very much discriminated against because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, because of all the other kinds of discriminatory legislation against Chinese, again, and also because of the McCarthy era, we were actually very glad to see China rise internationally prominently. It didn't really mean that people subscribed to communist or socialist ideology. A lot of it was a matter of nationalism. But people also started to understand the ideology that allowed China to become more of a world power. So a lot of people felt some pride in that. And I think that also contributed to the fact that people, you know, wanted to gravitate towards Chinatown and to do work in Chinatown. So that's how Yellow Seeds started. And I'm just going to share my screen and just give you a few slides here. Let's see here. Okay. Okay, well, first I was just going to give you a little background on myself. I grew up as a first generation, low income college student, you say. Okay, so right here in the lower right, you'll see Kong Chow Restaurant. So my family had one of those little restaurants out in, you know, one of the little cities in Vermont. And at the time, we were the only family of color there. I was the only kid of color in my elementary school. And so my family, like many others in Chinatowns at that time, had papers. We were not sin papeles, but we had papers which were false papers. And that had to do with the fact that because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, you might know that only certain people who had been here earlier, before the San Francisco fire, essentially, were supposedly legally able to come. So my family bought false papers, and that's my false paper brother there, who I only saw once in my whole life, and my mother and dad. And so we, of course, ended up too in ethnically tracked work. So my grandfather had a laundry, and then my father and his first cousin opened this restaurant. So then, I went from all white Rutland, Vermont to Boston Chinatown, where I lived in basically a tenement. And I attended a school which was highly segregated. It was 95% Chinese and 5% Lebanese. And it was built in 1848. So if you want to talk about school infrastructure and quality, this was a school that had no auditorium, no lunchroom, and the boys' bathroom was a trough of running water. The girls' bathroom had toilets, but I don't know if any of you have seen these ancient toilets that had a box on the top with a pull chain. That's the kind of, girls' bathroom that we had. So I mentioned this petition. So this is a copy of the petition from the students at Princeton protesting the war. And then, when I got to Philadelphia, okay, some of you asked me, well, what was Philadelphia like in 1970? Well, actually, there weren't that many people in Chinatown at that time. There weren't that many Asians in the Philadelphia area. And so this doesn't really give you the full thrust of what it was like. So the four corners of 10th and Race at that time were occupied by 4 bars that were basically Skid Row bars. Chicks here with the Go-Go Girls, that was the last one before redevelopment took place on that block with the rental housing. So let's see. I'm trying to advance here. Okay, for some reason I'm having trouble advancing my screen. Okay, so I wanted to show you just quickly the demographics. So in 1970, when I arrived in Philadelphia, there were supposedly, according to the census, 4,150 Asians. Although we're not really sure I'm not really sure where these figures came from. Some of these came from documents that PCDC had, and some of these came from the Chinese Christian Church. So I have to say there are no official figures, because it wasn't until 1980 that the census differentiated any more than between Black and Negro. Okay, but anyhow, these will give you an idea. So when we got here in 1970 to try to organize Yellow Seeds, oh dear, okay, there are only maybe 500 or so people living in the Chinatown area. And then in 1980, it grew a little bit, 703, but it wasn't until 1990, that would be after the Southeast Asian refugees came, that basically the population of Asians in the area really jumped, and then increasingly more immigration later on. So just to give you a sense, because I don't think that those of you who are here now can really viscerally understand like how desolate Chinatown was at the time. And it was desolate not because there were not so many Asians around, but also because this was still Skid Row. So on 9th Street, there were still lots of bars and flop houses. And in fact, some of you who've seen the Yellow Seeds newspaper might remember our first issue about an elderly gentleman who lived in the CBA housing, which is essentially a flop house. So here I'm just starting to tell you about the struggle against the Vine Street Expressway. And here the Chinatown residents in 1966 heard at a public meeting that basically the federal and state highway departments wanted to raise the Holy Redeemer Church and take down actually half the housing in Chinatown. It was going to cut a swath right through Chinatown. Okay. Sorry, I don't know why, but my screen is not wanting to advance. Okay.
Could you press the arrow at the bottom? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Nice.
Okay. So Yellow Seeds ended up being able to rent a storefront at 1006 Winter Street. Here we are outside. Okay. This is the crew. Mainly we were students, okay, college students, some grad students. And this was the issue for those of you, who don't know too much about this history of the struggle against Vine Street and saving Chinatown. The issue was this large expressway here, okay, which was going to be 10 lanes. It got scaled down, so it's not as large as it would have been now. There are going to be two ramps here, 9th Street and 11th Street, which have been basically concrete barriers. And then here, although it's not in black, these were supposed to be garages for Market Street East or the gallery. The really, you might say, well, at the time, this novel idea was that the city wanted to attract suburban shoppers to come into Center City. And this way, they could drive in from Jersey or wherever, come down the ramps, park in the garages, not step foot on Philadelphia land at all, shop, and then go back home. So we thought this was entirely, barbaric for one thing. So we started to organize. And so luckily, Howard Chin, who is, he must be taking the picture because he's not in here. Okay. Tony Toe here, he was an urban studies major. I was an urban planning major. And Howard Chin was an architect. He actually was an architect in Louis Kahn's famous studio. So the three of us had at least, some background, even though it was academic, we were really kind of helpful in pointing out the planning issues and really, starting to build a defense for Chinatown. So Yellow Seeds, though, did a lot more than just fight the expressway. So I wanted to give you some idea, some of the headlines that we had in our newspaper. So Yellow Seeds had a bilingual English newspaper, and we're sure it's the first one in Philadelphia. It was a rather amateurish attempt at the time, but you probably can't imagine what it would have been like because we had to use typewriters and we had to use X-Acto knives to cut out columns and then paste them up on boards with rubber cement and then take them to the printer. And if we made any mistakes, we had to type them out and then splice them in to the text. Anyway, so you see here we have headlines like democracy bypasses immigrants. That's the same issue we have today. It was about people without papers. It was about immigration policy, energy crisis, that's still around. Okay, police brutality, Asian women, issues of discrimination and sexism, third world unity. Today, we don't really talk about the third world. We may talk about the 2/3 world. But again, this was a question of expressing solidarity with the national liberation struggles all over the world. And so at the bottom, I wanted to point out that we aligned ourselves with liberation struggles of people all over the world against all forms of imperialism and colonialism. And that in the US, we actively participated in the struggle of people against attacks on the livelihood of workers, against racism, against sexism, and all other forms of exploitation. And we recognize that Asian Americans are a part of this broad struggle against a common enemy and part of a movement to build a society free of exploitation for all people. So what I feel is today, people are becoming more upfront about explicitly talking about more political ideology and using the terminology. I think in the 70s, when we were in Yellow Seeds, the discourse just in general was much more explicit. Okay, we read the Black Panther paper, we also, read Marx, we read Mao Zedong, we read Lenin, we read Amigo Cabral, Fanzafana. We read a lot of people, and this was not in school. I mean, this was, as part of being a political organization. So let's see here. I guess I'm going the wrong way. All right. And here, okay, here, yeah, this was a speech that actually I gave at a rally, but what I wanted to point out here was that on the right-hand side, we wanted to, again, point out our solidarity with Black people, Puerto Ricans, and Native Americans, and to also observe that the middle class was not served by capitalism either. The other thing we wanted to point out at that time was in the city, there are other communities such as Queen Village, Pennsport, Whitman, and these were white communities who are also fighting against urban renewal. There were also Black communities such as the Black Bottom that was up near Penn, and also other communities in North Philadelphia. Okay, so this is a famous picture at this point, and this shows one of our direct actions. What happened was we negotiated with the state all the time. In fact, we had weekly meetings with the state to talk about their plans for the Vine Street Expressway, because demolition was starting way up towards the Parkway, towards below the Art Museum. Okay, and we had struck a deal with the Governor Shapp at the time, that there would be no demolition in Chinatown with advance notice and without sitting down to talk about it. But what happened was at 6 o'clock in the morning on August 3rd, bulldozers came and just knocked down these houses right in front of Yellow Seeds. So we had a community telephone tree, not like today where you can just go on social media, but we actually had to have a telephone tree. So then people came to Chinatown, probably about, 8 o'clock or so. And and they were already working. And so we said, well, we got to stop this. So a bunch of us started walking up onto the pile of rubble. And then people said, oh, it's dangerous. You shouldn't be up there. Get down. And we said, no, we're going to stop this because we want to save our community. So I have to say that, the operators of the equipment were pretty sympathetic because most of them were African-American. And they said, well, we understand your struggle, and even though they were going to lose a day's pay, they were really supportive of us. So here we are, Yellow Seeds and other youth from Chinatown here. This guy here is Bill Baldini. He was a news reporter that came up and basically thrust us into the media, which was a good thing because we got a lot more press then. Now, we didn't do this by ourselves. We aligned with PCDC and the churches to confront the transportation departments around this issue. But I have to say too, we probably were what you might call the loyal opposition. In other words, we were with them in coalition against the Vine Street Expressway expansion, but we were also critical of certain stances that different entities in the community took. Okay, so Yellow Seeds, did focus on issues in Philadelphia, but I wanted to tell you that we also participated in the broader movement. So for instance, here, you see a flyer for March on Washington. Okay, we were part of the Asian contingent. This is one side of the flyer that says Asian lives are not cheap and Asians must say so now. Okay, and then here, this is the other side of that flyer. Okay, this is a Gook or a Jap slope change. Okay, this was the kind of racism that was going on. Excuse me. This was the kind of racism that was going on, the kind of microaggressions or even blatant racism that was evident on a day-to-day level. Okay, if you walk down the street, if you were in a grocery store, okay, it was not that uncommon. At the same time, we also participated with our sister organizations in New York City to protest with them against discrimination in the construction industry. Confucius Plaza was a big project in Chinatown, and there were a lot of protests going on around that. We also participated in 1975 in this protest against police brutality. Okay, this was way back then. This man, Peter Yu, was beaten up by the police basically for no reason, for standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. So there was a big rally in New York City at the time. Over here on the right, is a picture of folks participating in the AAU Thai movement. Some of you might know about this. This is an archipelago kind of between Okinawa and Japan, which was contested territory because of the resources underneath it. And at the time, Japan was saying that it belonged to Japan, and China at that time was saying it was on their continental shelf and it belonged to them. And at that time, because we were basically, you know, more pro PRC, we supported the international students who were protesting. And this is Tony Toe down here. He ended up being the CDC director in Seattle of one of their, I can't remember right now the name, of one of their very successful multi-ethnic housing developments. Okay. I don't know why this is happening again. Okay, so one thing that also was a benefit of mine being a part of Yellow Seeds was that the movement groups across the US got together and formed a delegation to the People's Republic of China soon after Nixon visited China. So this was a very special opportunity. So here on the left, that's a very young me. I'm there with a comrade from wherever we were visiting. And on the right-hand side is Merle Yamamoto, who was from Hawaii. And on the left is a picture of our delegation. Yeah, folks from New York, Boston, LA. Yeah, basically Boston. Yeah, I didn't mention that, all over. Okay. Okay, so I think I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. Maybe Grace, you might want to interject and direct me in a different direction.
Yeah, sure. So I think something maybe that you could talk a little bit about was, I think you talked a bit about how, like, who was in Yellow Seeds, but I guess I'm wondering if you could provide a little bit more detail about how Yellow Seeds started, and then how that kind of funneled into what AAU eventually became.
Well, as I mentioned, it started when a group of students, grad students and undergrad students, kind of met informally at Penn because they had mutual connections, right? And then started to talk about different ideas they had of what to do. So we started doing things like showing movies from China. We had teach-ins on Asian American issues, and we had people from all over come to talk at the teach-ins. And then we decided that we wanted to be in Chinatown. Part of it was to be part of the struggle against Vine Street. And part of it was because we took up the slogan, serve the people. Okay, serve the people was one of the slogans that the PRC basically promoted among the masses. And so we felt that we too should serve the people in our community. And I think that brought to us a certain attitude of not feeling as though, you know, we were better than people in Chinatown or knew more than people in Chinatown. And one reason for this is because many of us were sons and daughters of people just like them. I came from Boston Chinatown. David Toy came from Sacramento. You know, Tony came from New York City. Howard came from Miami. Okay, there weren't that many Chinese Miami, but his parents had a grocery store there. So we were, you know, very much like the sons and daughters of the folks in Chinatown, especially the restaurateurs. So at first we were red baited a lot, but we offered you know, services. First of all, we offered translation interpretation services. We ended up taking a lot of people to the unemployment office, to the doctors, to wherever, you know, and because we had language ability, because we spoke Cantonese and Toisanese, we really started to build bonds with the working people in Chinatown. So there was a differentiation there too, because the people who were leading the Vine Street struggle in PCDC or the churches were second generation Chinese Americans. But here in Philadelphia, it was interesting because they didn't grow up speaking Chinese. And so there was a kind of divide there, you know, and we were kind of in the middle, to tell you the truth. So So Yellow Seeds continued to fight this expressway and to build ties with the working people in Chinatown. In fact, they supported the newspaper. If you look at the newspaper, and some of you can find that in the resource list that Grace so kindly put together, you'll see that there are ads from the different restaurants and gift shops in Chinatown. That's how we supported the newspaper. But more than that, because we were a drop-in center, and because we help people with some of their daily needs, in terms of translation or tutoring too for the young people, the people that were in the associations really helped us raise money. So for instance, we rented our space from these Greek hot dog vendors. And one winter the boiler went out, and so we had no heat. And so the people that came to our movie showings got together, and they raised money to fix the boiler. But more than that, they raised enough money to buy us a new projector and folding chairs. So that gives you an idea of the kind of support we had. And then as time went on, we used to have October 1st celebrations, but we kind of outgrew the storefront, and we were looking for another venue. And the only other large venue was the Holy Redeemer Gym. But the sisters at Holy Redeemer and the Yellow Seeds people had a cordial relationship, but it wasn't exactly like a close relationship given kind of our different political and religious stances. But nonetheless, when we asked them if we could use it for an October 1st celebration, they acquiesced, and we were surprised. But then we said, well, that really is gratifying, because it kind of shows, we're being more accepted by the community. And for that October 1st celebration, all the food was donated by the restaurants. So, we were able to really build a mass base at the time. I have to say, though, after a number of years, because of different directions that were taken in the Asian American movement and in the progressive movement in general in the country, people decided that they were going to go into different areas of political work. So myself, I actually ended up going into the labor movement, and I worked in the garment industry here in Philadelphia for a number of years and did rank and file organizing. Other people went into machine shops. Other people went into shipyards. So around, I think 1977 or 8 or so, the storefront pretty much closed, and some people moved to New York and people moved to Detroit, and then AAU basically disbanded. So there was a hiatus there. And it wasn't until actually Debbie Way came back from Hong Kong. And actually, Debbie Way is the person who you should invite to talk about the beginnings of AAU. I'll say something about that, but really, we owe a lot to her. So she came back from Hong Kong and was anxious to, get involved in Chinatown. And she, well, I think at the time when I first met her, before we started AAU, she was going to Temple and getting a master's in education. So then when we were going to start AAU, she was teaching ESL. I can't remember where she was. At one point, she was at University City, and then she was at Key School. She was at different places. But basically, it was because of Debbie's interaction with the Southeast Asian refugee community that we started doing a lot of work. Okay. And at that time, let me see here. I don't remember if I have slides, but I might not have. So at that time, there was a lot of animosity against the Southeast Asian refugees that were resettled in Philadelphia. One prime reason was that the communities they were resettled in were primarily African-American communities, and there had been no consultation or preparation for this. So what happened was a lot of hard feelings about why were these people who the US was fighting before coming here, getting free housing, getting food stamps, getting help starting businesses, when African Americans who've been here for hundreds of years, had been enslaved, were really not getting the kind of support that they saw the refugee community getting, right? So there were a lot of racial incidents against them. And then, for the young people sometimes, organize to resist. And so then the police started picking up young people, and there was a lot of racial profiling at the time of young people. There was actually a mug book of Asian teenagers, the police used to pick up kids. So, well, let's see. I actually did have a slide about the beginning of that. Again, I don't know what's happening with my, oh, here we go. Okay. So in 1985, AAU formed, and I wanted to just go back and say, we formed around a kitchen table, basically, Debbie Way's kitchen table, or because Fernando Chang Moy and Paul Uehara worked at Community Legal Services, we would use their conference room after hours. Okay. And there was a vacuum at that time in terms of a progressive voice in the Asian American community in Philadelphia. Okay, so at that time, PCDC was still very active around, urban renewal and physical development, but they really were not the kind of organization to speak out against racism, speak out on behalf of the refugee community or deal with educational disparities. So these were things that AU started to take on as we began to, form a group. So the early part of our activism was because we had no storefront or staff or anything like that. We began writing letters to the editor, daily news, and getting some exposure that way. And so as far as some of the early folks involved, you'll recognize some of these names: Paul Uehara, Fernando Chang Moy, Shi Wen Law, Ming Chow. And there were some other folks who didn't stick around Philadelphia. There was a librarian, and I can't remember a couple other people. Debbie can help us out with that sometime. Yeah, so because of Debbie's involvement with the school district and with the refugee families, we started doing work with the youth, and the youth leadership program that actually the AAU has as its predecessor, the one that AAU started way back in the late 80s at the Calvary Methodist Church in West Philly at 48th in Baltimore. And that was because at that time, there were still a lot of Southeast Asian families living in West Philly and slightly further out in Southwest Philly. Right. And that program was modeled after the Freedom Schools. We also engaged in tenant organizing because the resettlement happened a lot of times in really substandard housing. And there was this large apartment building in West Philly called Admiral Court. So Debbie, Paul Uehara, and a woman named Natalie Imam, who was a paralegal at CLS and Cambodian, we all got together and organized the tenants at Admiral Court to get basically standard housing, upgraded quality housing. What happened with the resettlement agencies was that, and the city, was that they negotiated with these slum landlords who had let these buildings fall into disrepair for a long time. And they negotiated with them to let the refugees live there, but they didn't really demand that the slumlords do very much. So a lot of times there was no heat. There were, a lot of problems with the roofing. So there were leaks everywhere. And those of us that visited can remember going to the bathrooms and looking up. And since the bathrooms were stacked on top of each other, you were always worried that the bathtub from the floor above was going to fall down on the floor below. The other thing that was kind of remarkable was because, there's so much, there's, I guess, open doors and windows in these places. There are a lot of roosters running around as well. So Debbie, seeing what was happening in the school district also raised the issue of how the Southeast Asian students were not getting the kind of educational access they were entitled to. So she also worked with Len Reeser at the Education Law Center, and they found plaintiffs to start this lawsuit called YS versus School District of Philadelphia, which had a large impact on the ESL curriculum and on bilingual hiring at the school district. And so what happened is Debbie was inside the school district teaching and seeing what was going on. And then I ended up being asked to be on an advisory committee, which developed the remediation plan. And then later on, I actually also worked for the school district to try to bring about some resolution of some of these inequities that were happening with ESOL kids, but with immigrant and refugee families in general. So that's kind of a summary of some of our early activities.
That's so, yeah, it's amazing to hear these histories. And also, I think as like the current youth programs coordinator, it feels like such a, I don't know, like an amazing thing to be part of that kind of lineage. And so, okay, I think I have maybe 2 questions before we move on to Q&A with everyone else. So we have a number of AAU youth who are part of our current programs here on this call. And I think something I'm curious about for them and for myself as a young organizer, what is some advice that you would give to youth who are just starting their political journeys?
I think the first thing would be to start to know your own history, the history of our people here in the US, and that would be according to, your ethnic group also. The East Asian folks came here early, the Chinese, Japanese, and also the Filipino folks, we're here earlier on. But in terms of, say, folks from Cambodia, Vietnam, or Laos, they've had a different history. I mean, people from Hong Kong too. I mean, some of us have not really experienced, the effects of colonialism ourselves, but other people have. And so their struggle is somewhat different. So know your history, but also know the history of America, and of the different marginalized groups in America. It's very important to understand the history of African Americans, the history of enslavement, and also the history of genocide of the Native Americans. Because as you start to look at this history, you understand some of the threads that run through this. So as a shorthand, I would say white supremacy, okay? But white supremacy is also backed by an economic system. And basically, the Chinese in building the railroads and doing the mining set the structural foundations for the industrialization of the US so that it could emerge as a powerful capitalist state. So I think you have to understand those things and understand that whatever issue you're looking at, you have to look at its socio-political context. So some of you who are in the youth program, you remember this activity where you talk about little circle, big circle? That's kind of what I'm talking about. Like if you look at an issue, okay, you have to think about, well, what caused that issue? What are the different possibilities? What are the reasons this issue exists? And then you have to sometimes go even broader and say, why did those reasons exist? Is it because of government policy? Is it because of the way people think? Is it because of, the way that, people make money? I mean, there are a lot of reasons, but try to understand the big picture, right? And the thing too is understand that, all of us who come from marginalized communities have also, issues of belonging, issues, within our families, and that we are not alone. A lot of times you think, oh, I have this issue, I don't really want to talk to anybody about it because maybe I'm a little embarrassed. But really, all of us have similar kinds of issues in terms of, relationships, maybe with our parents, especially if we're 1.5 or second generation. We may have, issues in school, because of language, or because, we're maybe we're the only person of color, the only person from our ethnic group there, and nobody else kind of understands, why we have certain points of view. So I would say, AAU is a place that you can go to talk about these things. And the other thing is, don't forget your community. It's really important to give back to your community and to basically support each other so that we can be strong.
Thanks so much for that response. Okay, I do have another question, but I think I'm gonna open questions from the audience, and then maybe if we have time, I'll ask my last question. But yeah, so if folks have a question, you could either put it in the chat, or if you raise your hand, someone will unmute you. So you can ask your question yourself. Okay, we have a question from Lynn, who is one of our youth interns. Okay, I'm gonna ask you to unmute, Lynn. Okay, here
Okay,
we go.
can you hear me? All right.
Yes.
So, oh my God, miss you. Like, it's really nice to meet you. I've been like a huge fan of the Yellow Seeds like newspaper, and it's great to meet you in real person. It's nice. So I really want to like talk about the idea of like starting to be politically educated, and I feel like doing this kind of work, it's like so much history, right? And I think that a lot of people often don't have, like, we're at different paths and like learning things like that, like, oh, reading the Communist Manifesto, everyone don't really understand the complex language of these kinds of books and things like that. But I think that I really want to ask, like, coming from you, like, what is a good place to really start to like talk to people who really never really had any interactions with these kind of things? Because working with people who were like didn't know what model minority myth meant, like things like that. So where should we really start for people who are like just getting like the basic steps of getting their political education?
I think from my point of view, I would say start with your history. So for instance, start with Asian American history, because that will lead you into other things. But as far as reading political writings go, I think that will come in time. I don't really recommend reading the Communist Manifesto right away. I would say things that maybe are more accessible might be, well, let me see. I'm in education, so I am quite fond of Pablo Freire and the Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I think that is really good too as a kind of guide to organizing. Because one of the important things is to have humility when you go into the community, and to be able to not just, try to support people, but to learn from people. And Freire is very good at laying out why you should do this and how you can do this. And yeah, I think that would be great too, because that would help you in terms of what goes on in the youth leadership programs, because there's a lot of pedagogy there, and there's a lot of political education that goes on. I think the other thing is to show films that are relevant, that they could be on whatever issue people are interested in or working on. And I think those like films can generate a lot of questions and can lead you to other sources. Let's see. I'm also fond of Democracy Now! And one of the commentators, Juan Gonzalez, used to be here in Philadelphia. He's a journalist. And before he was a journalist, we met him when he was part of the successors to the Young Lords, the Puerto Rican Revolutionary Workers Organization. So he and a number of us, we used to have a book group. And yeah, I didn't speak about this, but Yellow Seeds also did a lot of coalition work with other grassroots, organizations of color. So we worked a lot with PRO, that was the Puerto Rican group, but we actually partied with them more than with anybody else. But we also worked with the Black United Liberation Front and with the Revolutionary Union, which was a white group in Kensington. And so when I was working in the garment industry, I also worked with PWOC, the Philadelphia Workers Organizing Committee. And some folks there, I mean, Ron Whitehorn and I still, see each other. So he now is doing educational organizing. Yeah. So the other thing I would say is, meet other groups too who are doing different things. And you'll learn from them. And sometimes, they'll tell you what they've been reading. I hope that's helpful.
We have a question in the chat that I can read. It's from Manting. This is an incredible session. I have loved learning about the history of AAU and Yellow Seeds. I'm so curious to know from your perspective, I'm assuming this is saying Mary, with the current highlight on the rise in anti-Asian hate, what are some actions that we can do to support our community?
Well, of course, organize, right? And I always feel that communities have the right to organize for self-defense. So I think the holler back sessions that have been going on to teach people how to interrupt, say, violence, those are valuable. I think that one thing is you have to have the attitude of, I guess I would say, being courageous. In other words, not accepting a lot of this anti-Asian violence. I mean, especially, microaggressions. And I think, well, I try at least to respond a lot of times to microaggressions, call people out on them. I mean, it's not maybe not always wise to do, but I think it's something you have to think about. The other thing is we have to put out a counter narrative, okay? Because the media is still putting out stereotypes about Asians and especially Asian women. I think they're getting a little better because there's all this movement, against what's going on, and it's causing people to come out and out of the woodwork, actually, as far as I'm concerned, expressing support, for the Asian community and against anti-Asian violence. But it makes me wonder how long this is going to last, because you have companies, that range from Verizon to Comcast to Origin, the Sephora, cosmetic companies, saying they support the Asian American community and they're going to donate money. But really, what does this really mean? Okay, and Biden is, put back the commission on Asian American affairs in the White House, and he's, and then there's this resolution coming out. Okay, I think these are all positive signs, but right now it's more talk than action, right? So I think we have to then push people to really implement measures that will mean something. So some of this has to do with really basically education, which is not going to necessarily give us a immediate benefit. But the issue is that people don't know each other and people don't know each other's histories, right? I mean, I forget who I was listening to, but someone was saying they heard an African-American person saying, well, how come the Asian Americans never got involved in the civil rights movement, without knowing about Yuri Kochiyama or Grace Lee Boggs, or people like Edna Odyssey, who, was down in the South. I mean, working with SNCC, right? So that's one thing. And then I think you have to keep Asian voices out there, talking about the roots of anti-Asian violence. Bring up our history, bring up that this thing really has its roots way back. The anti-immigrant sentiment goes way back to like 1789 or something like that, when Benjamin Franklin, advocated for a bill that was basically saying only lily white people should be admitted to the US. I think in terms of anti-Asian violence against women, it's important to point out how the US military has basically fostered that, okay? Because, where the US has bases in Asia, there are a lot of sex workers around those bases. And so that industry is supported by the military. And I think for many American men, that might be their first interaction with an Asian woman. So they bring back kind of stereotypes about Asian women.
Thanks for that response, Mary. Yeah, I think something I've really appreciated about your talk and also your answers to all the questions is like the ways that you trace all these different like threads through different histories, different stories. And yeah, I think it's important to have that kind of lens on how these things kind of manifest themselves in different iterations. Anyone else have any questions? We have about 10 minutes left. I'd love to hear from anyone or any of the youth. I know you guys are there. Okay, Wei has a question. I'm muting you, Wei.
Hi, Wei.
Hi, Mary. I mean, I probably asked this question a long time ago with Mary and many elderly about your involvement since when you was younger and to today. You still do a lot of work on the background to support the newer generation leadership. Like what energy keep you like and keep involved? What energy and what hope make you feel like it's important to continue to evolve? And we know there's so many people burn out in the middle of a way, right?
Mhm.
So I want to know more about what make you what is the motivation make you continue doing support work?
I also had this question, so I'm excited to hear.
Well, I think first of all, I have to admit that I was burned out after Yellow Seeds for a while. And so I probably took maybe 4 years off before I became involved again in social justice work. So the lesson there to me was that those of us who are active have to engage in self-care, and our organizations have to build that in. Okay, because there's a lot of not just physical labor, physical work, because you're going here and there and you're working long hours, but there's all this emotional labor that you are also putting in, because it's interacting with people, it's you're resisting oppression. So you have to take care of yourself. So that's one lesson that I learned from before. As far as keeping going, basically interacting with other people who are also committed to social justice, like yourself, Wei, like becoming friends with you and Jung and Trang and Bach. I mean, that really was an inspiration to me and still is. And as well, I think, one of the things I learned on a small scale, but which I basically extrapolated, was when I was working, in Yellow Seeds in Chinatown. And, when we needed money or we needed support, we relied on the everyday people, we relied on the masses. So I think I've learned that in the long run, you can rely on the masses, you can rely on people. I mean, sometimes it doesn't quite work out, but to tell you the truth, in terms of working people, they are more generous than anybody. I mean, they're more generous than the rich. I mean, the rich have all this money to throw around, but people who give from their hearts, those are the working people. So I think I take also inspiration from just ordinary people who are living their lives and trying to resist depression, just by surviving. And I think also there's a spiritual aspect to this that that really did not get talked about, especially in the 70s and 80s, because people tended to be kind of anti-religion. This was kind of this is probably kind of a side effect of Marx calling religion as the opiate of the masses. But I think that that's different from being spiritual. And so I think that we all kind of have to attend to the spiritual side of ourselves. And now that we're more attuned to the climate crisis and the environment, I think that to me is where I get my spiritual energy, from thinking about nature and the environment and the fact that we all are interconnected. Yeah. And I don't know if that's my answer. So I think each of us has to find his or her own answer, but don't forget the spiritual aspect.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I think it's I think something that I've been feeling in this talk is I think these past few weeks and months, I've felt quite tired and just exhausted by the news and all the work that goes on around different tragic events. And even just being in this talk, I think feels like is re-energizing in a lot of ways. So we have a question from Melissa. What's one thing you wish more people knew about in the API history?
I think I would wish them to know about the timeline of anti-Asian violence. A lot of people think that we have been immune from this kind of violence, but if you look in our history, we've also been subject to mass killings, to lynchings, right? To also the slower kind of violence of being, tracked into, into labor situations that have been dangerous or low paying, and then just throughout the years, of course, the Chinese Exclusion Act, Gomper saying that Chinese should not be in labor unions because they couldn't be assimilated because they were basically pagan and immoral. That kind of thing, as well as McCarran Act, the anti-communist stuff that was going on. Then Vietnam War, basically that was anti-Asian, people calling you a gook or a chink or whatever. So I mean, and then the fact that our communities have also been dispossessed, just like the Black, Puerto Rican, and Native American communities. So we may not have experienced a kind of oppression in degree as some of the other people that are, Black, Indigenous, people of color, but we have definitely had our share. And I think the other thing I want to say is that now that we have been subjected to this anti-Asian violence situation, I hope that we can also be more understanding and empathetic of our African American sisters and brothers. There's been talk, I also was in a group, that was trying to talk about and deal with anti-Black racism within the Asian American community. But maybe people can start to understand, how it feels for Black people to go out and to always having to be super vigilant, and that they might not know what might happen to them or their loved ones when they go out. So I think maybe this is a learning experience for us, and we need to take this to heart too.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that might be the last question for this evening, and we might wrap things up because I'm guessing people will want to eat dinner and do their evening things. But we want to welcome people in the audience to check out the resource list. There's some stuff that Mary has written that's really amazing. So you guys should check that out. And if you want to drop, affirmations or thank yous to Mary in the chat, either like in the chat with everyone or just personal message her, that would be great too. Because, I know personally, I feel really, really grateful for this space and for all the wisdom that Mary has shared with us today. So
Thanks, Grace. I want to actually put out a challenge if I can.
yes.
So an old friend of mine from the Puerto Rican Revolutionary Workers Organization named Wilfredo Rojas had asked me to write a piece when the Atlanta murders happened with the 6 Asian women. And so I did write a column for one of the newspapers that he also writes the column for, called Impacto. It's a Spanish language newspaper, and also Frontrunner New Jersey, which is some small outlet in New Jersey where he lives. But anyhow, I spoke about how he and I had worked together in an organization and had basically, started to bring people together across different language and ethnic barriers. So I said at the end of this piece that I wrote, that maybe Wilfredo and I could reignite this kind of organizing. And so then he wrote back and he took me up on it. So what I want to say is that if any folks out there are interested in getting together, and this is a very preliminary kind of thing, just to talk about, social justice issues in general, or specifically in the Philadelphia and Jersey area, I would welcome you. And Wilfredo and I are going to try to put together a group. And we're not sure where it's going to go, but if you're interested, please let me know.
Yeah, that sounds great. And I'm trying to think, what is the best way for people to contact you if that is something they're interested in?
I think you could put my email in the resource list.
Okay, great. Yeah, I will do that once this is all over. So if you are interested in this group that Mary and her friend are starting, I will put her email in the resource list, which also encourages you to read the article, which is in the resource list. And you can contact her through her email. Yeah, and so that kind of wraps up what we have planned for this evening. We are planning to have more of these. So if you liked what you experienced this evening, stay tuned for another community talk in the near future. And we just want to thank you all so much for coming today. And thank you, Mary, again, for all that you've shared with us this evening.
Yeah, thank you, AAU, and for all of those who came today.
Bye.
You around. Thanks a lot, Grace.
Yeah, of course. Can I stop the recording, Alex?